Right. So, welcome to our lesson on global wind pattern. So, we're going to talk about winds, what causes winds, and also what the major patterns of wind are on our planet. So, let's get started. Before we move on, we need to talk a little bit about density. So, a fluid is anything that can flow. That includes both air, gases, and liquid. So, you can have flow through the air, you can have air flowing, you can have water flowing. Anything that is less dense is going to float. Notice we have at the top here a less dense fluid and it's floating on top. Anything that is more dense is going to sink. And this is going to become really important when we talk about convection currents. So let's say we have some water in a pot and we have a heat source at the bottom. And we're going to look at a particular group of water molecules that are pictured here. So at cool temperatures, molecules tend to be densely packed, but when you heat them, they will spread apart. So we have the exact same number of molecules here that we did previously. They're just more widely spaced. Well, when you have these widely spaced molecules, that is a lower density and that less dense fluid will rise. Once you rise away from the heat source, though, the fluid is going to cool, it's going to contract back to become more dense, and once it's more dense, it's going to sink. And this can happen over and over and over again, which ends up forming what we call convection currents. So you'll notice there are convection currents in both the mantle. So you'll notice in the asthenosphere here, we have these convection currents where you have the heat source being the center of the Earth. When the liquid rock that's in the mantle warms up, it's going to rise because of the difference in density. It's going to flow, and then as it ends up cooling down because it's away from the heat source, it's going to sink again, and that forms these convection currents. Something similar happens in the atmosphere where you have the heat source is also on the bottom. In this case, it's the ground, which tends to absorb solar energy and then radiate heat out. And then as you go higher into the troposphere, temperatures get cooler. So near the ground, you have a warmer temperature. That air warms and then rises because it becomes less dense. Once it's farther away from the heat source, it cools and then it becomes more dense and it sinks down to the ground. A note about density and air pressure. So air pressure is the due to the force of gravity, and it's the weight of all the molecules above a certain part of the Earth's surface pressing down on the Earth's surface. So the more molecules you have, the higher the air pressure. The less molecules you have, the lower the air pressure. So in this diagram, what you're seeing is over here at this altitude, which is basically looks like sea level, you have a higher air pressure because there are more molecules pressing on you. Whereas here at a higher altitude, if you were, say, on a mountain, you would have a lower air pressure because you'd have less air molecules pressing on you. How does this relate to density? Well, as density increases, the air pressure increases. So warm air tends to have lower density and lower air pressure, and then cool air tends to have higher density and higher air pressure. Air pressure moves from areas of air moves from areas of high to low pressure. And this is very similar to how in biology you learn about diffusion, and how in diffusion things move from where there's a high concentration of them to where there's a low concentration of them. If you think about it, well, you have high density right here, high air pressure. Well, there's more molecules there. So if you have an area of low density nearby, molecules will spread out to move to the less dense area. That will mean that air tends to move from high pressure to low pressure. And this movement of air is what causes wind. So the ultimate source of this movement is what's called differential heating of the Earth's surface. Uh, Based on where you are in latitude, so we have the planet here at the bottom, this is the equator, and the most direct solar radiation happens to arrive at the equator. That's why the equator has the warmest temperatures. That higher air temperature causes the density of the air to decrease. It becomes lower density, it has lower air pressure, and that less dense air tends to rise. And that also creates a low pressure area, which is going to become important when we talk in a little bit. Then once it's away from the heat source, meaning once it's away from the surface of the Earth as you rise in the troposphere, you're going to get colder temperatures. So the air cools with increasing altitude or distance above the Earth's surface. That lower air temperature is going to result in a higher density because those molecules start shrinking or contracting towards each other. And that's going to cause an increase in air pressure, and then that dense air is going to sink. So you see these convection currents in the atmosphere forming high and low pressure areas, which is relevant because air will move from high areas of pressure to low areas of pressure. So that's where we get these wind patterns. A kind of caveat, you don't have air flowing like directly from the equator to the poles or the poles to the equators because of something called the Coriolis effect. So things when they're moving in the air might move in a straight line pattern, but the earth rotates underneath them, which makes it look like the object in the air is forming a curved path. Things tend to deflect or be pushed towards the right when they're moving away from the equator in the northern hemisphere, and to the left when they're moving away from the equator in the southern hemisphere. This is why when you'll see, like, if you see the flight path that a plane is taking or a rocket, it's always going to be a curved path because of this Coriolis effect. What relevance does this have? Well, it impacts weather systems. So here we see two storm systems. In the northern hemisphere, they're called hurricanes. In the southern hemisphere, they're called cyclones, but they're the same thing. And notice that these systems rotate. That rotation is caused by the Coriolis effect deflecting these winds of these storms in a certain direction. So in the northern hemisphere, storms tend to rotate counterclockwise. If you ever see like a radar image of a hurricane moving, you'll notice the rotation of the storm. And then in the southern hemisphere, storms tend to rotate tend to rotate clockwise. Similar things happen with tornadoes as well. So now we're going to talk about what are called air circulation cells. And let's look at how air circulates. So we have the equator right here. We have the poles on either the left or the right side. Let's talk about what's going on. So when you have the most direct heat coming to the equator from the sun, that's going to cause warm air that's going to rise because it becomes less dense. Once it reaches the upper areas of the troposphere, it's going to get colder and it's going to sink. So that causes high pressure areas. This we've looked at before, but there are other areas with these kind of stereotypical temperature and air movement patterns. So, for example, near the poles, you're going to have the coldest air that we have on the planet, and that's going to be where you have air sinking. But once it reaches the Earth's surface, it's going to warm up, and as it warms up, it's going to rise again. That's going to form a low pressure area. So at the poles, you have high pressure, and then about a third of the way down in latitude, you're going to have a low pressure area where you're going to have air rising because its temperature is changing. And then remember, air moves from areas of high pressure to low pressure. So it's going to move from this area of high pressure to this area of low pressure. Same thing at the poles. It's going to move from the poles towards the lower latitudes because it's moving from high pressure to low pressure. And those movements of air create what's called a third circulation cell, where you're going to have some air that rises, and instead of moving towards the poles, it's going to move towards the equator. And as it cools, it's going to sink and create a high pressure area. These are air circulation cells. And notice, once again, we have air moving from a high pressure area to a low pressure area, forming these wind patterns along the surface. We have names for each of these circulation cells. So the one closest to the equator is called a Hadley cell. The one at the mid-latitudes is called a Ferrel cell, and the one near the poles is called a polar cell. You're going to have to just straight up memorize a Hadley cell and a Ferrel cell where they're located. I have seen some free response questions in the past where you're asked to describe how these cells form. So you can review this slide if you need to go over that again. So these air circulation cells Here we have a Hadley cell, Ferrel cell, and a polar cell. Because of the Coriolis effect, actually, you don't have air moving straight from, say, this 30-degree north line to the equator. Instead, it's going to be deflected, if you remember. And so that's going to cause these prevailing wind patterns. Here we have like trade winds that are near the equator. In the mid latitudes around where we are, we have westerlies, which tend to blow from west to east, which is why if you want to know what the weather's going to be like in Dallas, as a general rule of thumb, you can kind of look like what the weather's like in Fort Worth, because for the most part, storm systems tend to move from west to east. We're in a strange part of the country, though, in Dallas, where we've got a lot of different wind patterns interacting. Sometimes we get weather moving in from the north or the south. So, how does this affect weather? Well, let's talk about humidity real quick. Humidity is a measure of how much water vapor is in the air, and temperature affects how much water vapor can be retained in the air. So, warm air tends to hold more moisture than cool air, and when you cool warm, moist air, that's going to cause water to condense, which is initially going to form clouds because clouds are water droplets suspended in the air. And then as more and more condensation happens, eventually those drops become big enough that the water precipitates out. So let's look at how air circulation cells affect precipitation. As you have warm, moist air rising, because generally warm air is going to be moister than cool air. And remember, most of the moisture or water vapor in the atmosphere tends to be concentrated around the equator, just because that's where it's warmest and you have a lot of evaporation happening. As that warm, moist air rises, it cools, and the water starts to condense and form clouds. Eventually, when enough water condenses, you have precipitation, and then you're going to have rain systems. So these areas around the equator and in the mid latitudes tend to have the most precipitation. That's where you're going to find those biomes where you get a lot of water, a lot of rain. On the other hand, when you have cool, dry air that's sinking, that air starts to warm and it's capable of holding more moisture. When that happens, you have a higher rate of evaporation than you do of condensation, and those areas tend to have drier climates and have biomes where the plants and animals are more adapted to less precipitation. These are the areas where you tend to have deserts. So, if we look at each of these circulation cells, what we'll see is that we have these particular patterns of precipitation. So, the Hadley air circulation cell is next to right near the equator. It extends from the equator to the subtropical zones, which is about 0 degrees latitude to 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south latitude. At the equator and the tropical regions, you have higher precipitation because you have higher humidity, you have more water vapor in the air. As that warm, moist air rises, it cools, that forms clouds, that forms precipitation, and that's why you tend to have a clustering of tropical rainforests around the equator or equatorial region. In the subtropical regions, which are closer to the 30-degree mark on latitude, you're going to have cool air descending as it warms. It's going to absorb more moisture than it releases, so you're going to have higher evaporation rates than condensation. You're going to have less cloud formation, and this is where you tend to have the drier biomes like savanna or desert. The Ferrel circulation cell, if you remember, is mid-latitudes. This is where we have those westerlies that we tend to experience. This ranges from 30 degrees to 60 degrees latitude, both north and south of the equator. And it's mostly formed by the interaction between polar and Hadley cells. The major biomes you find here tend to be forests, both deciduous forests and coniferous evergreen forests. Then the polar air circulation cells go from 60 degrees to 90 degrees, which is basically the poles. So 60 degrees to the North Pole on the northern part of the planet, and 60 degrees south latitude down to the South Pole. These tend to be the drier areas just because the air here, no matter how warm it gets, tends to be colder than air at, say, the tropics. Most of the water that you see precipitates in the form of ice or snow. You have lower temperatures, more severe winters, and lower precipitation. And the major biomes you have in these areas are tundra and taiga. So that is it. And our next lesson should be hopefully loading tomorrow.